I always believed loyalty would keep me safe. For 15 years, I poured my heart and soul into a company that felt like my second home. So, you can imagine the sting when my boss dismissed me without warning, like I was nothing but a forgettable statistic. Yet, deep down, I sensed this betrayal coming long before they uttered those fateful words. Shock turned into a cold, simmering fury. This is my story, how I uncovered their schemes, turned every lie upside down, and claimed a victory no one thought possible. Buckle up, this tale of revenge is about to unfold. There was a time when I believed in the shining promise of my job. My name is Eliana Delacroix, though everyone called me Ellie for short. I was 23 when I first entered the towering glass building of Kennington and Crestwell Solutions, wide-eyed and eager to prove myself. I remember stepping onto the glossy marble floors of the lobby, my heart hammering with a mixture of excitement and nerves. The company seemed to radiate a sense of prestige, my very own golden ticket into a better life. From the moment I was hired as a junior coordinator, I went the extra mile for every project. My boss then was a kind woman named Linda, who taught me how to navigate corporate politics with subtlety and grace. She'd always say, "You can catch more flies with honey than vinegar." I was too young to understand how valuable that lesson was, but I tried to follow her example. Linda left the firm for health reasons just a year later, and that was when Carl Collingwood, who would become my longtime boss, stepped in to take over. Carl was everything Linda wasn't: loud, brash, and supremely confident. He took up space in every room he entered, and it was impossible to ignore him, whether you liked him or not. I still remember the first words he said to me: "Ambition is everything, darling. Let's see if you have any." For a long time, I genuinely admired that about him. He seemed unstoppable, made big promises, and delivered big outcomes. Working under him was like riding a roller coaster, exhilarating but laced with fear that I might plummet at any moment. Over the years, I weathered every storm that Carl's leadership imposed. I stayed late, working on his pet projects. I shrugged off disrespect from clients. He insisted we take on for the good of the company. I managed budgets, proposals, and entire teams that seemed to spin out of control under the intense pressure he created. Every day was a battle, but I never wavered. I believed if I fought enough, if I persevered, I'd earn his respect, or at least a well-deserved rest at the top. 15 years. That was how long I dedicated my life, my entire prime working years, to Kennington and Crestwell. In that time, I'd seen multiple reorganizations. I'd trained new hires and said goodbye to friends who had to relocate. I celebrated the births of my godchildren, who called me Auntie Ellie, in the break room because I was too slammed with work to leave. In some ways, the office had become more of a home than my cramped apartment just a few subway stops away. But as time went on, I noticed something. People like me, who had stuck around and grown comfortable, didn't have the upward mobility we once imagined. New names joined the executive leadership. Meetings were increasingly taken over by fresh, younger faces who spoke in start-up jargon. Management hammered the notion that we had to adapt or die, as if we were ancient dinosaurs clinging to outmoded ways. I started to feel the creeping suspicion that I was no longer valued for my experience, apparently. Experience was old-fashioned. Despite it all, I kept pushing, convincing myself that my loyalty would pay off. Carl, I thought, wasn't blind to how much I had contributed, right? He had to see that I was more than a dispensable cog. After all, I had practically built entire frameworks for his projects from scratch. My name might not have been on the neon sign outside, but my handprints were all over the success of Kennington and Crestwell. But a quiet dread settled in me over the last year I spent there. Conversations would halt the moment I walked into a conference room. Emails about future plans didn't always include me. Carl grew uncharacteristically polite, like he was tiptoeing around something or someone, trying not to get noticed. That's when I realized the writing was on the wall. I was no stranger to the cyclical layoffs that happened under the guise of streamlining. I'd personally helped with the severance paperwork for many of my co-workers who had been let go without warning. I'd seen Carl do it, always with a veneer of professional courtesy. So I recognized the signs all too well. Still, knowledge is one thing, and acceptance is another. A pit grew in my stomach, swirling with fear and resentment. There was a war inside me, the pragmatic side telling me to update my resume, get prepared, maybe even jump ship on my own terms, versus the loyal side that hoped, maybe beyond reason, that 15 years of hard work might insulate me from the worst of corporate betrayal. Then came the day that sealed everything in place. I was in Carl's office, presenting a quarterly review of one of our top clients. He fidgeted with a pen as I spoke, not even bothering to look up at me. Finally, he said in a clipped tone, "That's enough, Ellie. I've already read your report." My cheeks burned with humiliation, but I pressed on. "I just want to ensure you have all the details, Carl," I replied quietly. "Details." He repeated the word with a sneer. "We'll talk about this another time. For now, you can go." I knew then the conversation was over, both literally and figuratively. He didn't want my input. All those hours I'd spent meticulously compiling data and analyzing results meant nothing. On the way out, I saw him pick up the phone and murmur something about timelines, budget, and HR. The final pieces clicked in my mind. They were preparing to cut me. Not only me, but perhaps a few other long-timers who were too expensive in this new era of lean, mean business. My heart felt like it was made of stone as I left his office and walked back to my desk. But instead of cowering, I felt an unusual sense of clarity. If this was the game they were playing, I wanted to know the rules, and I wanted to see if I could turn them to my advantage. For too long, I'd been the loyal soldier. Now I was going to fight my war. Quietly, methodically, and with every bit of the shrewdness Carl had taught me to wield over the years. That evening, I shut myself in my tiny apartment, ignoring the pile of laundry and the half-eaten cereal box on the kitchen counter. I booted up my laptop and began poring over every document I'd meticulously saved in my personal archives, emails, presentations, spreadsheets, everything that revealed my substantial contributions to Kennington and Crestwell's success. Like many employees, I'd kept a repository of files. Part of it was a habit from needing quick reference points on projects, but part of it, if I'm honest, was a cautious measure. I'd seen too many co-workers blindsided and left with no proof of what they'd done or how integral they were to the company's achievements. And there it was, in black and white and color-coded cells, countless hours of my life poured into projects that had boosted the firm's revenues by millions of dollars. Strangely, seeing my effort in concrete data stirred something inside me. It wasn't arrogance, but a hard-earned sense of pride. While Carl took the credit publicly, these files proved how crucial I was to each endeavor's success. If Kennington and Crestwell thought they could just discard me like an empty soda can, perhaps it was time they learned the weight of that can. I worked until midnight, transferring files, archiving emails, and taking copious notes. My eyes burned from staring at the screen, but my mind was on fire. If Carl was going to let me go, I wanted to be ready. Part of me contemplated simply walking away, letting them have their victory while I found a better place. But that was the old me, passive, too trusting in other people's goodwill. The betrayal I sensed coming had changed something fundamental inside me, catalyzing an inner defiance that refused to be invisible any longer. The next day, I returned to the office with new eyes. I noticed how certain glances lingered on me as I walked by. Some staff members avoided making eye contact, as though they knew a secret they couldn't share. It wasn't paranoia. There was definitely an energy shift in the air. Meetings took on a cryptic tone, with Carl referencing necessary structural changes that he insisted would make the company more agile. I forced a polite smile, but the bitterness in my throat was hard to swallow. Despite that, I channeled my anger into a heightened awareness. I attended every meeting with a pen and notepad, making mental and physical notes of who said what, who implied something else. In the break room, I overheard younger managers boasting about how the old guard was about to be purged. They didn't use that exact word, but their smugness made the implication clear. I pretended I was picking up coffee while my ears burned. So, that was their plan, to replace seasoned employees with cheaper, more malleable hires. One lunchtime, I pulled aside a friend, Sabrina, who had also worked there for a long time. She looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes. She admitted she was worried about her job too. "They've been calling me in for these random performance reviews," she confided. "And it's always the same story. They find little mistakes and blow them out of proportion, as though I'm incompetent. It's like they're building a paper trail to justify firing me with cause." My stomach twisted with a mixture of empathy and outrage. Sabrina was one of the hardest workers I knew, never one to shirk her responsibilities. "Stay strong," I said, giving her hand a squeeze. "We're not powerless, you know." She flashed me a shaky smile. "I hope you're right." I left that conversation more determined than ever. Watching Sabrina's defeated posture lit a fuse inside me. For so long, we'd accepted the scraps of recognition tossed our way, quietly persevering, believing that someday our loyalty and experience would be rewarded. It was time to shatter that illusion. Over the following weeks, I approached our tasks differently. Where Carl tried to exclude me, I found subtle ways to reinsert myself. If they were going to push me out, I wanted to see it all from the inside, no surprises, no illusions. I also began digging deeper into the company's dealings. There had been rumors over the years of questionable ethics, inflated project costs, hush-hush vendor dealings, and padded invoices that might have made certain pockets heavier than they should have been. Nothing had ever been proven or publicized, but Carl's ambition had always been borderline ruthless. If there were skeletons in the closet, I intended to find them. Working evenings at home became my new normal. Each day, I uncovered more about the structural changes Carl was pushing. At the end of this realignment, they planned to scale back senior employees. Several among us had been identified as candidates for early retirement or termination due to performance issues. My blood simmered every time I read those words. Performance issues? My track record was impeccable, and they knew it. But corporate spin is a powerful tool, and they had every intention of painting us in a negative light to justify their actions. Then I found something else, something that made my heart pound as though I'd stumbled across a hidden treasure chest. Buried in old emails and transaction logs was evidence suggesting Carl had engaged in questionable consulting agreements that shuffled funds around without proper oversight. Not only that, but there were whisperings of a major contract that had been misrepresented to investors. In simpler terms, it appeared that Carl had artificially inflated the project's success metrics to secure more funding from the board. It was risky to assume wrongdoing so quickly. I wasn't a lawyer, but I knew enough about the company's operations to recognize that those numbers did not add up. If my hunch was correct, Carl had effectively lied to top stakeholders to get the green light for expansions and massive bonuses for himself and a few of his cronies. This revelation filled me with a visceral sense of validation. He wasn't just morally questionable, he was possibly corrupt. I knew I had to tread carefully. If I confronted him directly, it would only speed up his plan to get rid of me. So I decided to bide my time, gather more evidence, and consolidate everything I needed to blow this wide open if they dared try to throw me away. All the while, Carl had no idea that with each belittling comment, with each closed-door meeting, he was fueling the quiet storm brewing within me. I felt a bit like a chess player, planning moves and countermoves far in advance. The difference was that this wasn't just a game, it was my livelihood, my future. For too long, I'd allowed my sense of loyalty to overshadow my self-respect. That Ellie was gone. In her place stood a woman who refused to be a pawn any longer. The fear that once held me back was now transforming into a sharpened weapon. The final blow came one rainy Monday morning. I arrived at the office, umbrella dripping onto the lobby floor, to be greeted by the HR manager, Celia. She wore the grim expression of someone who didn't want to do what she was about to do, but had no choice. In a hushed voice, she asked me to step into one of the conference rooms. I could barely feel my legs as I walked inside. There, standing by the window, was Carl. He turned at the sound of the door and gave me a curt nod. "Take a seat, Ellie," he said, his voice oddly gentle. Refusing to let him see any fear, I stood tall. "Let's get this over with," I replied, my tone as crisp as his fancy suit. Carl raised his eyebrows, then exchanged a quick glance with Celia, who had settled at the opposite end of the table, folders stacked in front of her. "We've conducted an internal review of our staffing needs and have concluded that certain positions have become redundant in our new structure," he began, reciting the scripted HR drivel. "Unfortunately, Ellie, your role is among those being eliminated." A hush fell over the room as those words, as expected, landed. I refused to look away from Carl. I watched him grip the edge of the table like he was bracing himself. He might have been anticipating tears or protest from me, but he got neither. Instead, I quietly asked, "Is there a severance package involved?" Celia cleared her throat and slid a folder toward me. "Yes, Miss Delacroix. We've outlined the terms here. You'll find that we've been fair above standard market practice, in fact." I glanced at the folder but didn't open it. Instead, I fixed my eyes on Carl. This man, whose approval I once craved, couldn't even hold my gaze. Finally, he said, "I'm sorry, Ellie. It's just business." A mirthless laugh escaped me. "After 15 years, you boil it down to that?" He didn't respond. The silence was suffocating. For a moment, I thought about taking the folder, thanking them, and walking out with whatever dignity I could muster. But then I remembered the mountain of evidence I had compiled. I recalled every late-night session of rummaging through suspicious records, analyzing the internal finances. My heart pounded, and a savage sense of satisfaction welled up within me, but I wasn't ready to expose it yet. Instead, I calmly placed my hand over the folder and said, "Thank you for clarifying." I paused, letting the tension thicken. "I'll read these documents carefully, and I'll expect that everything is in order." Carl gave a stiff nod. "Of course, everything is absolutely in order." I managed a brief, tight smile. "Then, if there's nothing else, I'll be on my way." I walked out of that conference room into a whirlwind of emotions. Part of me felt surreal after so many years. My worst fears had come true. I was jobless, replaced, presumably worthless in the eyes of this corporate machine. But the other part of me, the spark of defiance that had grown into a roaring fire, refused to accept that verdict. I felt a powerful clarity, as though the last cord tying me to illusions had finally snapped. I was free to act. Over the next few days, I finished packing up my desk in a quiet hush. Some people expressed sympathy, giving me sad smiles or awkward pats on the back. Others avoided me, perhaps feeling guilty or simply relieved it wasn't happening to them. Sabrina hugged me with tears in her eyes. She whispered, "I'm so sorry, I might be next." I squeezed her hand. "Hang in there, this isn't over." She frowned, not understanding. But I couldn't explain. Not then, not yet. When the day finally arrived for me to hand in my ID badge, I walked to Carl's office to say goodbye. He sat behind his desk, tapping away at his computer. The moment he saw me, he closed his laptop, likely worried I might catch a glimpse of something I shouldn't. A flicker of irritation crossed his features. Why should he be on edge, having already won? "Ellie," he said, trying to sound cordial, "I trust everything is settled." I gave him a long, measuring look. "I have what I need, Carl. Thank you." Then I placed my badge on his desk, turned and left without waiting for a response. That night, I stared at the severance documents at my kitchen table. They offered a lump sum payout and extended benefits for a few months, which was indeed more than the bare minimum. Reading the legal jargon made my head spin, but one clause stood out like a red alert, a non-disclosure agreement. The language was broad, effectively gagging me from discussing any insider information about the company if I accepted their offer. That was their real strategy. They wanted me gone and silent. My eyes narrowed. They knew I was privy to some significant knowledge. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother stuffing the NDA with so many far-reaching clauses. I had two choices: sign and pocket the money, or reject it and keep the right to speak. On that night, in the harsh glow of my dining room lamp, I made the decision that changed everything. I wouldn't sign. My story would be told, and the truth would come to light, no matter what. Revenge wasn't an impulse for me. It was a methodical plan that took shape over weeks, guided by an anger that refused to be silenced. While Carl and the company might have dismissed me, they had no idea I'd been quietly preparing for this moment. I wasn't about to watch them sabotage more lives without consequences. I filed for unemployment but also spent hours every day strategizing. I reconnected with former co-workers who'd been shoved out under similar circumstances. Some had left quietly, grateful for the severance. Others felt coerced into signing NDAs out of desperation. But a few shared my fury. They had unspoken, festering resentments toward Kennington and Crestwell, and, oh, the stories they had to tell. We formed something of a clandestine alliance, meeting at out-of-the-way coffee shops to swap anecdotes and evidence. It felt surreal, like we were characters in a spy novel. But we all had enough bruises, financial, emotional, professional, to justify the risk. Sabrina was still at the company, teetering on the edge of being pushed out. Through her, we gleaned updates on Carl's next moves. She also managed to surreptitiously pass along internal memos that hinted at the continued corruption within the upper echelons. I reminded her to be cautious. One slip could end her job and likely blackball her from the industry. She nodded gravely, but the fear in her eyes was tempered by a spark of determination. My biggest hurdle was the looming threat of being sued if I exposed anything that might be considered proprietary information. Kennington and Crestwell had deep pockets and an intimidating legal team. I couldn't just waltz into the press with a folder of documents. I needed a strategy that balanced the truth with legal caution, ideally forcing the company to face its wrongdoing in a forum where they couldn't easily silence me. Around this time, I decided to consult a lawyer, a friend of a friend, who specialized in employment law and whistleblower cases. Her name was Maya, and she was unassuming in appearance, but positively fierce in spirit. She listened intently as I walked her through everything I'd uncovered, from the questionable vendor contracts to the inflated performance metrics. She asked pointed questions, scribbled notes, and occasionally let out a low whistle when I revealed something particularly damning. When I finished, Maya leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Ellie, this is serious. If you can prove these irregularities amount to fraud, Carl and possibly several others could be in deep legal trouble." My chest tightened. Hearing her say it aloud made it all the more real. I need to be sure. I don't want to accuse them unjustly. But if what I suspect is true, I want them to face the consequences. They hurt me, they hurt countless others, and they'll keep doing it if we don't stop them. She nodded. We'll need to be strategic. We should gather enough evidence to withstand scrutiny in court if it comes to that. Meanwhile, we must protect you from retaliatory lawsuits. The NDA question is key. Did you sign anything? I shook my head. No, they offered me a nice severance package, but I refused it because of the gag order. I still have the proposal, though. Maya's lips curved into a small, satisfied smile. That's excellent. It means you're not bound to confidentiality on these matters. The challenge is proving wrongdoing without crossing into disclosing trade secrets. But from what you've told me, Carl's cooking of the books is far beyond a mere trade secret. It's illegal. By the time our meeting ended, I had a clearer plan: gather more concrete evidence, possibly from Sabrina and others still inside, and then file a formal complaint with the relevant regulatory bodies, those that oversee corporate ethics, financial reporting, and so forth. Depending on the outcome, it might spark an investigation or even a lawsuit. The entire process could take years, but the important part was that Carl and the company would face accountability. As I left Maya's office, a sense of both dread and anticipation swirled in my gut. Part of me wondered if I was biting off more than I could chew. Kennington and Crestwell wasn't a small-time operation. They had money, connections, and influence. Carl could make my life miserable if he knew what I was planning. But then I remembered the humiliation of being cast aside. I remembered Sabrina's trembling hands and the hush that fell over the office each time someone was quietly let go. And I remembered how Carl had looked at me, so sure of his invulnerability. It was time for that invulnerability to be shattered. When I got home, I opened my laptop and clicked on the folder I'd labeled KC Evidence, where I kept a meticulously organized trove of data. My heart pounded with adrenaline as I realized this was no longer just my insurance policy. It was my sword, and I intended to wield it with precision. Over the following weeks, I worked closely with Maya, sending her encrypted files and redacted documents. She, in turn, reached out to her network of forensic accountants and investigators. Slowly but surely, we built a case that looked more formidable each day. Meanwhile, I began discreetly emailing my network in the industry. I reached out to old mentors, to acquaintances who had found success at different firms. While I didn't disclose details, I made it clear I was seeking a position and that I had left Kennington and Crestwell due to ethical differences. I braced myself for the possibility that I'd be blacklisted. Carl, or someone from the executive team, might spread rumors that I was difficult or uncooperative. But to my surprise, I received a fair amount of sympathy. The corporate world was evolving. More people were becoming aware of the damage wrought by toxic leadership. While I didn't land a dream job overnight, I got enough nibbles that I felt cautiously hopeful about my financial future. In parallel, an undercurrent of rumors began swirling around Kennington and Crestwell. Sabrina sent me anxious texts. They're suspecting a leak, and Carl's going ballistic about unauthorized data leaving the building. My heart raced each time I read those updates. I felt a pang of guilt for putting Sabrina in the line of fire, but she insisted she could handle it. It's time he sees what it feels like to be powerless, she wrote. And so, like a volcano building pressure beneath a deceptively calm surface, my revenge took shape. It wasn't about petty retribution. It was about exposing the rot at the core of a company that prided itself on excellence while cannibalizing its own loyal employees. It was about ensuring that others wouldn't be blindsided the way we had been. And yes, it was about reclaiming my dignity, proving to myself that I was more than just a disposable resource. The storm finally broke on a crisp autumn morning. I was sitting in a modest co-working space I sometimes used, sipping cheap coffee and reviewing job postings, when my phone buzzed with a call from Maya. There was urgency in her voice. "They're holding an emergency shareholders meeting in 3 days," she said. "The word is that someone on the inside tipped off the board about the financial discrepancies." My pulse raced. We both knew that someone on the inside was likely connected to our efforts. Whether it was Sabrina or another ally, it didn't matter. The point was, Carl's empire was beginning to crack. "Should I be there?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "As a witness?" She paused. "Shareholders' meetings aren't typically public, and you no longer work there. However, if they start pointing fingers, it might be time for you to step forward. Just be prepared. Once you go public, there's no turning back." I swallowed hard, adrenaline coursing through me. I've been ready. Those 3 days passed in a haze. I tidied up my evidence, making sure everything was in place should I need to present it. Meanwhile, Sabrina sent frantic updates. Carl was panicking, calling last minute strategy sessions, likely trying to plug any leaks and spin a narrative that absolved him. Some of the younger managers, the ones who'd been so smug about the old guard being phased out, now looked uneasy, as though they sensed the precarious house of cards about to collapse. Then came the day of the shareholders' meeting. I spent the morning pacing my apartment, too restless to focus on anything else. About an hour before the meeting was set to start, my phone rang. It was Sabrina, her voice trembling with excitement. "Ellie, there's a group of shareholders who demanded to see all financial records pertaining to the suspicious contracts." Carl looks like he's about to have a stroke. He's scrambling for damage control. Also, HR is being asked about allegations of wrongful termination. That last part made me raise my eyebrows. "That's you and everyone else they pushed out," I said. "Yes," she whispered. "Word is spreading fast that we might have evidence. People are angry. Some major investors threaten to pull out if the board doesn't conduct a thorough investigation." My chest felt tight, a mixture of vindication and anxiety. This was the moment I'd worked for, yet it was terrifying in its magnitude. Before we ended the call, Sabrina assured me she'd let me know if I needed to come in. She then clicked off, leaving me alone with my swirling emotions. An hour later, my phone buzzed again, a message from Maya. "Get to the corporate headquarters now." I hardly remember the ride there, only the neon swirl of city life passing in a blur outside the taxi window. My heart thundered as I walked through the building's revolving doors one last time. The security guard recognized me but seemed uncertain whether to let me pass. Before he could say anything, Celia from HR rushed over, her face flushed. "Come with me," she said breathlessly, guiding me toward a back corridor that led to the executive meeting rooms. I realized she might be in on this uproar, maybe not as an instigator, but at least as someone who wanted justice done. Outside a large wood-paneled door, Celia paused and whispered, "They're inside, waiting. The board wants to hear from you." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Pushing open the door, I stepped into a room that felt supercharged with tension. Board members I recognized from company events were seated at a long table, laptops and stacks of documents scattered around. Carl stood at the far end, arms folded, a deep scowl darkening his features. He almost bared his teeth when he saw me. For a moment, an awkward silence reigned. Then one of the board members, an older gentleman with silver hair, motioned for me to join them at the table. "Miss Delacroix, thank you for coming. We understand you may have information that's pertinent to some. Troubling discoveries we've made in the company's financial practices." My throat felt dry, but I forced myself to speak clearly. "Yes, sir, I do," Carl cut in, voice trembling with barely contained anger. "She's a disgruntled former employee. She was let go recently for performance issues." I held up a hand, glaring at him. "That's a lie." and you know it. Then I faced the board. I worked here for 15 years, building up this company's success from the ground floor. I'm not here out of bitterness. I'm here to tell the truth about fraudulent activities orchestrated under Carl's direction. An audible gasp rippled through the room. Carl looked like he wanted to leap across the table and strangle me, but one of the board members shot him a warning glare, forcing him to remain silent. With shaking hands, I opened my bag and removed a stack of carefully curated documents. These files detail several inflated contracts, suspicious vendor payments, and manipulated metrics presented to investors to secure funding. I gathered them during my tenure, and I've since had them reviewed by legal counsel who specializes in corporate fraud. The patterns are undeniable. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from shock to grim determination. One of the women, her eyes cold, asked me to walk them through the highlights of the evidence. For the next half hour, I summarized every piece, pointing out how the data had been doctored, how Carl had used shell vendors, and how the inflated success metrics had contributed to an artificial valuation of the company. Carl tried to interrupt multiple times, accusing me of tampering with the data or misunderstanding complex financial details. But I remained composed, shooting down his attempts with facts. Here is the original spreadsheet from 2 years ago, which I personally prepared, I'd say, and here is the version that was submitted to the board. Notice the discrepancies in revenue numbers. Each time, his face reddened further, his bluster replaced by sputtering denial. When I finished, the room fell silent. It was as if everyone was collectively absorbing the gravity of what I'd just laid out. Finally, the silver-haired board member spoke. "Miss Delacroix, we appreciate you coming forward. The board will need to verify these documents with our own investigation. But if this is accurate, there will be serious repercussions." My shoulders felt light, as though a massive weight had been lifted. I offered a single nod. "I understand. I'll fully cooperate and provide any additional information you need." At that moment, I locked eyes with Carl. His face was contorted with rage. The man who once dismissed me so casually now looked rattled to the core. For a moment, I almost felt pity for him. But I remembered what he'd done, how he'd robbed loyal employees of their livelihoods without a hint of remorse. No, he deserved what was coming. In the chaotic days that followed, the board launched an internal audit. Regulators were alerted. Gossip within Kennington and Crestwell reached fever pitch. While Carl wasn't immediately stripped of his position, it was clear his days were numbered. He walked the halls in a state of perpetual anxiety, snapping at staff and slamming doors. Several of his inner circle managers scattered, attempting to distance themselves from the brewing scandal. Sabrina, meanwhile, told me about hush-hush rumors that Carl might face criminal charges if the fraudulent activities were confirmed. I tried to keep a low profile, but the corporate grapevine was unstoppable. News of my confrontation in the boardroom spread like wildfire, turning me into something of a folk hero among the rank-and-file employees. Many reached out to me on social media, thanking me for standing up to the toxic leadership. Sabrina confided that morale had never been higher. People felt like they finally had hope that the toxic cycle might be broken. My own feelings were a complex mixture of relief, worry, and a tentative sense of triumph. I was relieved that the truth was out, worried about potential backlash or legal entanglements, and yes, triumphant that I had reclaimed my dignity, not just for myself, but for all those who had been wronged. I'd done what I set out to do. A few weeks later, I received a call from one of the board members. Her name was Harriet. She invited me to a private lunch, saying she wanted to discuss some important developments. We met at a quiet bistro, far from the glimmering towers of Kennington and Crestwell. Harriet was cordial, but I could see the lines of stress around her eyes. "Thank you for meeting me, Miss Delacroix," she said after we ordered. "We've completed the the preliminary audit, and I have to say, your accusations were valid. More than valid, actually. Our auditors found numerous instances of misconduct. Carl is being placed on indefinite administrative leave, and we're preparing for a deeper investigation that will likely result in his termination. My emotions swirled. Even though I'd expected this outcome, hearing it stated so plainly was almost surreal. I see, I managed, taking a sip of water to calm my nerves. Harriet continued, the company owes you a debt of gratitude, though I realize you didn't do this for recognition. Nevertheless, we'd like to make amends. She reached into her briefcase and handed me a white envelope. Inside is an offer of a settlement and a formal apology from the board. It includes compensation beyond what you would have received originally. I stared at the envelope. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over me. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt like this was just the company's attempt to protect itself from a potential lawsuit. Still, Harriet's expression seemed genuine, not merely transactional. Why now? I asked softly. Before the investigation is fully closed, she sighed. Because the damage to our reputation is already done. We want to do right by employees who were wronged, and you're at the top of that list. We also hope to avoid a lengthy legal battle. You have every right to sue, and we realize that could be devastating for us. This is our attempt to show sincerity. I'm not here to strong-arm you. I opened the envelope and skimmed the contents. It was a substantial amount. Enough to pay off debts, live comfortably while I found a new job, and maybe even start a small business if I chose to. The apology letter, though brief, acknowledged the company's failure in protecting loyal employees from unethical practices. It was an admission of guilt, albeit carefully worded. Setting it aside, I met Harriet's gaze. I'll consider this, but I need to make something very clear. I'm not just looking for a check. I want to be sure that the culture at Kennington and Crestwell changes, that no one else goes through what I did or what so many others did. She nodded, her expression serious. That's our priority as well. This fiasco has shaken us to the core, and we're determined to rebuild on a foundation of integrity. I believed her, or at least I wanted to. Some cynicism lingered after all. Corporate culture is notoriously resistant to change. But Harriet's demeanor suggested she was genuine, and perhaps this was the best outcome I could hope for without drawing out an endless legal war. By the time lunch ended, I felt like I was standing at a crossroads. I could accept the settlement and move on, or I could push further, demanding public acknowledgement of the wrongdoing. But as Harriet said, the damage was already done. The press had gotten wind of the internal investigation, and articles speculating about Carl's fraud began surfacing online. Kennington and Crestwell's brand image was tarnished, and it would take years for them to regain trust. Justice, in its own slow, crooked way, was being served. I left the bistro with a feeling of cautious optimism. There was no denying that the company was acting in self-preservation, but at least employees like Sabrina would stand a chance at a healthier workplace environment. And Carl, well, Carl faced the consequences of his choices. Whatever the final legal outcome, he would never again be the untouchable titan he once pretended to be. In the aftermath, I found a certain peace settling into my life. While I still felt a pang when I thought about the years I'd invested in Kennington and Crestwell, I also realized how much I'd gained in the end: my self-respect, my voice, and a renewed sense of possibility. With the money from the settlement, I paid off lingering debts and set aside a portion to cover my living expenses for at least a year. For the first time in my adult life, I could breathe without the burden of immediate financial stress. It was liberating, and with that freedom came a clarity about what I truly wanted to do next. I began flirting with the idea of launching my own consultancy. Over my years at Kennington and Crestwell, I'd built a wealth of knowledge about project management, team leadership, and strategic planning. Why let that go to waste? I spent my mornings drafting a business plan, my afternoons exploring potential client leads, and my evenings reading up on the latest industry best practices. The sense of purpose I felt was electrifying, like I was finally directing my energy into something that mattered to me personally, rather than slaving away under someone else's demands. Meanwhile, Kennington and Crestwell continued to make headlines as the scandal unraveled. Carl was officially terminated, and rumors hinted that the company might press charges against him to distance themselves from liability. A few lesser-known executives also resigned, presumably to avoid being implicated in the investigation. Sabrina kept me updated, saying the atmosphere was still tense, but improved like a weight had been lifted. She'd been promoted to a senior position, and under new management, she felt hopeful about the company's direction. It was a small victory, but I couldn't help feeling proud that we'd sparked real change. One day, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was unsteady at first, but I recognized it as Carl's. My heart leapt into my throat. "What do you want?" I asked, my tone cautious. He hesitated. I just want to talk." A surge of conflicting emotions rolled through me: anger, bitterness, curiosity. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop near my apartment. Part of me needed closure, to see the once mighty giant humbled in person. When I arrived, Carl was already there, looking disheveled in a wrinkled suit. He'd lost weight, dark circles under his eyes, revealing sleepless nights. Seeing him like this was unsettling. It reminded me that no one is inherently untouchable. He barely met my gaze. "I heard you got a settlement," he began quietly. "The board's scapegoating me, you know. Not that I'm innocent, but they're acting like I was the only one responsible." "It's not my job to worry about that," I replied evenly. "We both know what you did. You built your career on exploiting people and bending rules until they broke." He sighed, running a trembling hand through his hair. "I won't deny it. Look, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I see now how badly I messed up. All those years, I pushed and pushed, never caring about the cost. And now," his voice caught, "I've lost everything." A strange sense of pity tangled with the anger inside me. I didn't want to let him off the hook. He'd done real harm, but I also realized that part of me had already moved on. I'd found a new sense of purpose, and I no longer needed his validation or his apology. "Good luck, Carl," I said finally. "I hope you learn from this, and don't repeat the same mistakes if you ever get another chance." He nodded, tears in his eyes. Then, like a ghost, he rose and left. For a moment, I sat there, sipping my coffee, trying to decipher the whirl of emotions in my chest. But ultimately, I felt relieved. His remorse, sincere or not, was irrelevant to me now. My path was no longer tied to him. That night, I went home, lit a scented candle, and opened my laptop. Another piece of my future was calling, a message from a potential client who'd heard about my new consultancy through a friend. They wanted to discuss a contract to optimize their small tech firm's operations. I grinned, typing out a quick professional response. In that moment, the final remnants of Kennington and Crestwell's hold on me shattered. I was free. The next weeks passed in a bright flurry of energy. I signed my first official client contract, making enough to sustain myself while I continued to grow the business. I spent evenings celebrating small milestones, whether it was finalizing a project proposal or simply setting up a workable home office. Each success was a reminder that my identity extended beyond the corporate walls where I'd once given away too much of myself. When Sabrina updated me that the board had released a public statement acknowledging systemic failures under previous leadership, I felt an odd sense of closure. Though the statement didn't mention me by name, it validated that the company had recognized and was attempting to rectify the moral failing that had led to so much suffering. In that quiet moment of reflection, I realized something powerful. My revenge wasn't about destroying Carl. It was about revealing the truth and rebuilding what had been broken, my own self-worth and the sense of justice that so many of my colleagues deserved. The real victory was reclaiming my voice and finding a new path forward, unburdened by corporate shackles. My story doesn't end with a neat bow. Kennington and Crestwell will likely spend years dealing with the fallout. Carl's fate remains uncertain. Maybe he'll land on his feet in some reduced capacity, or maybe he'll fade into obscurity. But that's no longer my concern. What matters is that I fought back, and in doing so, found the courage to stand on my own. Thank you for joining me on this journey, my 15-year odyssey through betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimate redemption. My story is proof that we all have the power to fight back when injustice tries to render us silent. We can reclaim our voices, shed the weight of fear, and stand stronger than ever before. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever faced a situation that seemed impossible, I encourage you to reflect on the courage you hold within. Let's continue this conversation by building a community of support, understanding, and empowerment. Don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with someone who might need a spark of inspiration, and subscribe to my channel to hear more real stories of triumph and hope. Together, we can create a world where every voice matters and justice always has its day.